What is today Latin America was once many native nations. Spain, Portugal, France, England, the Dutch, and Danish all invaded. They carried out genocide after genocide and enslaved both natives and Africans. After independence, most new governments were still white-dominated, with more genocides against natives in nations like Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. European powers hold on to some territories even today and kept invading to take their colonies back. The United States invaded too, overthrowing or trying to overthrow over 60 governments, the last attempt in the year 2020 in Venezuela. The U.S. also took half of Mexico's land and a tenth of its people, and then Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. There's a long history of many Americans fearing and hating Latinos. Latin America's image and reality is often one of instability, poverty, drug cartels, revolutions, corruption, and refugees. But it did not have to be this way. Latin America could remain all or mostly native nations. I spoke about this in detail in the previous series, What If Natives Won? White domination, poverty, foreign invasions could have all been stopped, prevented, or limited. The U.S. could have been more Latino culturally, with higher numbers of Latinos. The U.S. could have been less racist, less dominating, or the U.S. could be defeated. Some Latin American nations could even become regional or world powers. There's a huge lack of alternate history about Latin America and Latinos. So much alternate history is Europe-centered, mostly because so much history and history teaching is Europe-centered. This series is dedicated to scenarios, points of departure, and possibilities of Latin American victory within Latin America, and a more Latino or less racist American society. My name is Al Carroll. I'm Associate Professor of History at Northern Virginia Community College. I've written mostly about wars, veterans, human rights, and genocide. My next history book will be Genocide Denial in America, about the 7 genocides against indigenous people that took place in the U.S. that most people were never taught about, don't know, or deny. I've also written some science fiction, mostly alternate history. One story, Timely Saviors, appeared in a short story collection, The Witness Paradox. I'm also, together with Rob Schmidt of Bluecorn Comics, editing and putting out a short story alternate history collection, What If Natives Won? Or Killing Columbus. I've also written a sci-fi alternate history book, The Man in Black, the first of a series. There is no figure in Latin America who has been more of a boogeyman for America than Fidel Castro. But he undeniably is one of the most influential figures in Latin American and world history. He affected not just Cuban and Latin American history, but U.S. history, Soviet history, and even African history. Hysteria and deliberate falsehoods from Cuban exiles is why he's a boogeyman to many. Castro has done both a great deal of harm and a great deal of good. How would the world be without him, or with someone other than him leading Cuba at that time? In Cuba itself, Castro caused the deaths of about 8,000 people. That is the most accurate figure, not the ridiculous tens or even hundreds of thousands of deaths claimed by Cuban exiles. Of those 8,000, most were either killed in battle or put to death after show trials. Though they didn't have any chance to defend themselves in court, almost all of those executed likely were guilty. They were mostly Batista's agents, torturers and murderers themselves. But if you object to the death penalty, as most do, you wish they had been in prison for life rather than executed. Castro's actual worst repression in Cuba was mass imprisonment. In the late 60s and early 70s, Cuba had the highest proportion of political prisoners anywhere in Latin America. In the late 70s, almost all of them were set free, thanks to pressure by American President Jimmy Carter. From the 80s to the 2000s, the number of political prisoners in Cuba was typically between 50 and 200. The last of them were set free thanks to pressure from Obama. A small number serve sentences today, from a few months to several years, many of them for working with American agents or others seeking the overthrow of the government. In return, Cuba became one of the most developed nations in Latin America. Its healthcare is about as good as the Americas, as the United States healthcare is. Almost all Cubans own their own homes. Cuba has had a mixed economy since the 90s, and multi-party elections electing their own parliament. Cuba has half a dozen political parties and mass organizations and a far higher voter turnout and participation compared to the rest of Latin America or even the U.S. But at the top, its leader was unelected, first Fidel and then Raúl. Its current leader, Díaz-Canel, was only indirectly elected by parliament, not the public. Outside of Latin America, the biggest effect Castro had was on Africa. Most Cubans have black ancestry. Cuban volunteers fought for black liberation in South Africa. They defeated South African troops, making apartheid end sooner. Cuba's defeat of South Africa also led to the independence of Namibia, what was once called Southwest Africa. But in Angola and Mozambique, Cuba's volunteers helped win victory for one-party states. In theory, they were communist. In practice, they had mixed systems that did a lot of business with Western companies and later China. Both Angola and Mozambique have poor human rights records. They are authoritarian, but not totalitarian. Angolan and Mozambique people were still far better off than they had been under Portuguese colonial masters, who had among the worst slave trade, and in the 20th century, an outright fascist state that killed tens of thousands of Africans to stay in power. The worst thing Castro ever did was send Cuban troops to side with the Ethiopian government. The civil war there overthrew its emperor and ended feudalism, but also killed over 1.5 million Ethiopians. Ethiopia's famine was especially notorious to the rest of the world, leading to efforts like USA for Africa and Band-Aid. Even then, the new communist government used the aid mostly for weapons. Ethiopia's communist government also tried to brutally crush the independence of Eritrea in the north. What if Castro never led Cuba? There were over 600 assassination attempts on his life. If just one of them had succeeded, the first of them were actually before he even took power. Over 36 attempts ordered by Eisenhower. While Fidel was the best known of the Cuban revolutionaries, he was not alone. The second was his brother, Raul Castro. Unlike Fidel, Raul was a communist from the start. He was not the same military commander as Fidel or Che Guevara. He was also less charismatic, or much of a public speaker or writer. Fidel, in his speeches, often warned his brother was more brutal than he was. The evidence doesn't show that. Raul made pragmatic compromises the few years after he took over from Fidel. Camilo Cienfuegos was the third leader of the rebel movement. Cienfuegos was avowedly not communist. In our own time, he died in a mysterious and still unsolved plane crash. If he avoids this and is Cuba's leader, he leads the nation in a leftist but not communist direction. But this may not stop American attempts to overthrow or kill him. Of the two, Raul would make Cuba communist earlier had he won, but he had little charisma, so a victory and long leadership is less likely. His time, should he rule, is unlikely to be very different from his brother's. Cienfuegos, on the other hand, is unlikely to take Cuba into war in Ethiopia, but he is just as likely to fight against apartheid and colonialism in South Africa, Angola, and Mozambique. The one leader we know will not lead Cuba is Che Guevara, no matter what those who romanticize him hope. He left Cuba early to fight failed uprisings in Africa and Bolivia. The biggest change with Cienfuegos is that likely there is no Cuban Missile Crisis. Cienfuegos is unlikely to invite Soviet missiles to be stationed in Cuba. Without that crisis, he is also perhaps likelier to be overthrown by the US, even though he's not communist. But putting another Batista-style US-backed dictator is unlikely to last long. It would just continue the cycle of US domination of Cuba failing. Cuba would likely be much more like its neighbor, Dominican Republic. The Dominican Republic was dominated by the US with dictators up to the 1970s. Then it slowly emerged as a democracy where all the major parties are leftist but not communist. It is corrupt, but not as corrupt when it was a dictatorship. It has plenty of violent crime, but the death toll is still far lower than under dictators. And American governments frankly quit caring about who the Dominicans elected as leaders once the Cold War ended. Please repost freely, like, quote, and comment. This has been Latin American Victory. Next time we'll discuss what if there were no Mayan genocide.